Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Today we'll be talking with Marc Epner from Simple Flight Radio about the benefits of recording your in-cockpit audio when you fly, and we'll tell you lots of different ways you can do it. Plus, we'll have the links to all the gear we talk about in our show notes, which will make it easier for you to purchase any of the gear we talk about today. And in a future episode, we're going to do a deep dive on how to record great video when you fly. And speaking of great video, Marc and I do a lot of show and tell in this episode, so I've also made a video version of this episode, which our $20 a month and up Patreon supporters have been able to view for the past couple of days. And because I'm sure you'll want to see that video, I've just released it to all Patreon supporters, so at whatever level you might support the show, you'll be able to view that video on Patreon. And if you've thought about signing up as a member to support the show in the past, well, now would be a great time to do it, so you'll be able to watch the video version of this episode. To sign up to become a member and support the show, and to view the video, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, since you're all awesome listeners. Last week in episode 275, we talked about what fixed-wing pilots need to know about helicopters, especially about their rotor downwash and wake turbulence. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/275. And so that you don't miss next week's episode, go to whatever app that you're using to listen to me now and take a moment to just touch either the subscribe or the follow key, depending upon the app, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And if I sound a little different today, it's because I'm on day 4 of a nasty cold, but I'm definitely feeling better. Now let me tell you a little about Marc Epner. For over 30 years, he's worked in a variety of sales and sales management jobs, primarily in the software industry, and he's currently director of sales at Click. He first got his private license in 1976, but then took a 25-year hiatus. He now has about 2,500 hours. He is the host of the Simple Flight Radio podcast, and we had him here on episode 97, talking about the Leading Edge Flying Club at Chicago Executive Airport, and again on 252, talking about situational awareness. And now here's our conversation with Marc Epner. Marc, welcome back to the show. Great to have you here again.
Oh my gosh, I've been waiting for this probably since the closing of the last time I was on. So it's been a while. That gives you some insight into my life.
Well, the good news is we're going to have you back on again real soon. Now, you and I both do a lot of in-flight recording of both audio and video. So I thought today we'd start with the simple stuff, audio recording, and then in a later episode, talk a little bit about video. So to kick us off, tell us first, what are some of the reasons that you record either audio or video when you fly?
The thing that started it was, I have to be honest, this thing that I have that says I want to share the passion of aviation. So I started thinking, to the ability to put videos out on YouTube, but even just share among friends and family and other pilots, because there's some neat moments. So it was this idea of sharing. But what I learned, I had a partner in my SR20, and he was taking instrument training. And when I saw what he did with both audio and visual, if you will, or video, working with his instructor, he used apps, the third-party apps that break down what happened on the flight and use it as a wonderful debrief tool. And so I noticed when I started doing that, even when I wasn't with a CFI, I could pick out mistakes I made or maybe best practices. There was a lot of benefit that through self-analysis or maybe even sharing with the CFI if I wanted to, that you could pick out, hey, that was pretty good. Oh, I forgot to set the backup altimeter. Well, that was a mistake. Or forgot to raise the flaps before I hit the appropriate speed. Little things like that. And then when people ask me questions about how do I set up my radios, I'd also have, well, here, this is how I do my radios, and notice my flow. So it was all about sharing. It was about debriefing, picking up best practices and such. And it just started to grow from there. Then just the mere fact of having history of all the flights I've taken, right? So I save everything. So I can go back to any flight I've ever taken and listen to at least, well, sometimes when I didn't do it right, I'd get a lot of engine noise and nothing else, but certainly the video was there as well. So I guess put it into those 3 categories. I've just seen tremendous value and fun in doing it.
Yeah, and your comment about the engine noise on the audio strikes a chord. There is no question that this is not as simple as it might seem. It is really easy to screw it up, and I'm sure you and I both have lots of terrible audio and terrible video.
I think we probably do, and all for the same reasons, because they're common mistakes. I I actually talked about this to our flying club one time because they were asking when they found out I was doing some YouTubes. And we had a session, and the gotchas, they were coming throughout the membership of the flying club, but they were very similar, connections, things I'm sure we'll get into today.
Yeah, indeed. And so it does take a lot of practice. You're not going to get great audio, great video the first time you try it. That's almost guaranteed. And as we're talking here, I'm thinking, man, I really should have created a checklist because when I'm in the, most recently taking helicopter lessons, there are just a dozen different things to set up, and it's easy to miss one. So anyway, this is an area that's ripe for checklist. Let me just mention when I first started recording, and that was over 20 years ago when I was working on my CFI. And I took a cassette recorder with me, and I would record the audio for each of the flight lessons. And I found that invaluable. I would go back and listen to each one, take notes. And I think the primary reason this works so well for me is I've learned over the years that I'm just not a great audio learner. If somebody says something to me in the airplane, it kind of goes in one ear and out the other, but it helps to go back and listen because I just can't remember the dozens of things that are said or that happen on the flight. So at a minimum, I think that when people are taking flight lessons, working on their private, working on that instrument, they really ought to take notes almost immediately afterwards so that they can capture some of the things that occurred during the flight. And then if you can, go ahead and record the audio as we're going to talk about today. And then, of course, the higher level, which is more complex, which would be to record the video. But with a helicopter, I am sure that I got to solo at least 4 or 5 lessons faster, which is a big savings of money, simply because I could go back and I could pick up on all those little subtle things that I missed as we were up there learning in the helicopter.
That's a great point. One of the things that you just kind of sparked a thought in my head is I am absolutely a visual learner. Forget about recording or anything like that. So I take notes. I use an iPad at work and take all these electronic notes. But when I'm learning something new, I'm not just trying to remember something. I have to get it in video format, or I shouldn't say have to, but I just am so much better. That's why in the old days, when you could get the videotapes, sure, I could read a Gleim book to pass a knowledge exam, a written exam, but it just was so much harder than listening to John and Martha or Sporties or whomever came out with it. And that's just because that's my learning style. The other thing, though, that you mentioned that I thought of when you were talking about it is, if I did that, took all the recordings, do I have the discipline to go back and listen to it? Right? It's so easy. And we do this, again, in my work life, which has nothing to do with aviation. We take notes, we record Zoom calls. I don't go back, maybe because I don't have time. I don't know. Maybe it's a laziness, but I would think that would be a problem for some subset of the population. They put all the work in and then don't go back and take advantage of it.
Well, let me mention a new tool that's available that I've used. This was not available back when I was recording my CFI lessons, but it is now that I'm doing the helicopter. I will sometimes just take the audio and I will run it through a transcript type tool. So, for example, you can go to Otter, I think it's otter.ai. The one I use is Descript because it has other tools that I use for podcast production. And the transcriptions these days are so much better than they were even 5 years ago. And so I'll just run it through the transcription, and then I can quickly kind of find, where's that point in the audio that I want to listen to? So I think that's a way that you can very quickly look through an hour and a half of flight material and get to what you want without having to listen to the entire thing.
Great point. And again, I'm going to stop talking about non-aviation meetings, but I've noticed when I record my Zoom calls that it has a transcription. That's pretty good. I don't use it much, but you've just given me a little motivation to really take a look at it and see if there's a value there.
Sure. Now, there's one other thing that I'll use audio for in flight, and this is kind of a fun one, and that is that I will sometimes broadcast or live stream Facebook Live. And I've done this, for example, when I'm flying over the Monterey Bay, maybe at 1,000 feet, just to kind of show people, hey, this is what it looks like flying over here. One day I was in the traffic pattern at Half Moon Bay, and I live streamed, 4 or 5 landings that a client was making. But the great thing was that there was a whale just right on the base leg, which was feeding down there. So every time we'd go around the corner, there was another picture of the whale and all the seagulls around it. So Facebook Live can be a lot of fun as well. And you can use all the techniques that we're going to talk about to do that. Of course, the downside there is you have to have a cell phone connection. And I found that, if you're 1,000 feet above the ground, you're more likely to have a cell phone connection than if you're up higher.
Well, I'll let you instruct me in that. I've done none of the streaming.
Let's take a little diversion here for a moment, and let's talk about safety. Do you think there might be times when it doesn't make sense to record, as the pilot might get distracted by using that process?
It comes down to discipline. So absolutely, but that may be more on an individual basis. The other thing that has impacted a decision whether to record or not is if I'm rushed and I got to get this going and I've got it maybe not get there-itis, but I need to get moving. When I feel that, I just throw the kit in the back seat and say I'm not using it, because first and foremost, like the aviate, navigate, communicate, that applies to these extraneous fun things as well, and nothing takes the place of it. So if I can see it's already becoming a distraction before I even close the door, I just don't use it, and I will throw it in the back seat.
Yeah, there have been times when I've chosen not to record in the cockpit, and just because I knew it was going to be a distraction, we need to focus on the task. If you can get everything set up ahead of time, then that can minimize the distraction a little bit. But I will say that trying to set up as you're flying along, really bad idea. It just consumes too much time. And I think part of why I think about this is I remember flying with a gentleman in a fairly fast aircraft, and we were approaching an instrument approach, and it was literally a minute and a half away. We were in a busy metro area, and he's taking selfies and photos, and I'm thinking, this is absolutely crazy. It's kind of like the people that are stepping over the fence of the Grand Canyon to get a better view. Some of those people fall off the edge of the canyon, and the same thing can happen in airplanes. You need to focus first on the flying, and all the selfies, hey, that's totally secondary or tertiary. You can't be focused on that as your main activity.
And it's not just the on and off, record or pause or shut down, because what I find happens to me, and again, this probably happens to all, is let's say I touch a little bit on video. I've got a bright out the window and a darker panel. And so on the back of my GoPro, you hold your finger where you want to set the exposure. Don't be doing that flight, because now I got to move my seat back, because usually the camera is like just behind me. So I might have to move away from the rudder pedals. And sometimes I'm not connected on my cell phone, my smartphone, because you can control things if you've made all the connections. So that speaks to your comment about get set up before you start thinking about aviation. And then you're in a much better to do it, especially if much better position to do it, because now I've got the controls in front of me and I don't have to distract from looking forward to play with the camera. Is it recording? Is my cable on? What's in the viewfinder? If you have the ability through your smartphone, which may be right up off to your right, let's say on the center console, and you have a moment where you can do that safely, now the risk is mitigated. But if not, and you're constantly having to move away from the controls, that's just a bad accident waiting to happen of whatever degree.
Yeah, and the good news is that the audio is by far the simpler thing to record in the airplane. And here's what I don't think people realize. I believe that for flight training purposes, 90% of the value comes from the audio. And yet everybody gets hung up on I need the video. You know what? You're not going to see that much more on the video. Yeah, okay, you may notice on a landing, hey, I was drifting a little bit to the left or something like that. But most of the time, I think the value comes from the comments from the flight instructor. So the return on doing just audio is huge. If you decide to go to video, now you're into a whole new game of complication and expense for what I think is really marginal additional value.
Exactly. And I love the video, just again, because I'm a visual learner and that's all that I'm very focused on. But to your point, I just did a couple videos about situational awareness, which is one of the things we talked about last time. And to hear the conversation, not only with the CFI, but now in this case with ATC, and to help yourself build a map of what's going on so you know and one of mine that dealt with, okay, I asked the question, we played a little ATC audio. My questions were, how many airplanes? Where were we going? Who had the fastest airplane? Who was going to be first to the airport? And it's been my experience, most pilots that I deal with in the private pilot area don't build this really complex map, especially in Chicago or California, like where you have a lot of traffic, to build a map, and it just enhances situational awareness so much. But there's so many questions we can answer, and by playing that audio back, you go, oh, wait a minute, okay, 2 airplanes come in, and one said they're working on a fuel problem. Are they going to declare emergency? I already been cleared. Yep, they declared an emergency. Now I've made a 180 and I'm heading away, but we knew that in advance because we were listening to that. And to be able to pick that up in arrears, if you will, after the flight, you can start to build that situation awareness, or even hear mistakes that ATC or you made in readbacks and such. So I love listening to ATC audio and cockpit conversations as well.
Yeah, it's great because you definitely can improve your ability to talk over the radio and to, as you said, to kind of pick up on what's going on around you. And of course, the other thing is sometimes we capture something really funny. That's just kind of fun.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, I had one, and it was embarrassing because I think of myself as pretty good with my communications and my situational awareness. And I was heading toward my airport, and then we're 8 miles northeast, actually pretty much north of O'Hare from straight line. And I'm coming in about 15 miles west, and all of a sudden a glider, which we never see in Chicago, pulls up right in front of me. ATC didn't see him and all that. And I just panicked. I basically pushed talk, said diverting left 10 degrees. And the Chicago approach is saying, who is this? What are you talking about? And he kind of laid it into me, but I was just so shocked to just see an airplane pop right in front of me within probably a mile and a half in front of me at 4,000 feet. I was in Bravo. I don't know how he didn't pick him up, but it was just a reaction. And then I pushed the button and talked. And then to listen back, Marc, you got to think better than that, right? So to hear that, now it's put in some muscle memory. I always start my conversation with like 973 Sierra Delta and let them know that I'm scared, but who I am, so they can help me out.
Yep, makes total sense. Well, let's talk about some of the sources in the airplane where pilots can grab the audio. Where do you pull the audio from the plane when you're recording?
Through necessity, I've had to do it in a couple different ways. The one thing that changed how I did things was when I bought the in-flight cam. I'm going to hold this up, cable, which allowed this to go with the C connection to go into my GoPro, so where I'm getting the video, and then using the rest of the cable, which has a headphone jack and here, so you can kind of go into an existing connection, right, where you can put your headphone jack here and plug this in. So now it splits it, and then we'll take it into the GoPro. The problem is it stopped working for some reason recently after working, and there's some things we can get into when we get into the gotchas. So that's my primary go-to. But when I started having problems with this, I bought a separate sound recorder. And this came from some folks actually the people that run Bold Method, who are friends of mine as well. And this is what they use. So now I have a separate high quality audio source. I never have issues. There's some ways we have to work with it to integrate it into video, but I bring this with me on every flight, and it's got AA batteries. So they work forever. High quality, a lot of control. So this is the other place that I get it. And, if you want ambient sound like engine noise, the GoPro is going to pick that up, but you might see it even on a smartphone. People pick it up there. But my primary is either through the camera with the cable like this or a separate sound recorder.
Okay. So it sounds like the primary way you're grabbing the audio is you are plugging into the intercom system in the airplane. You could, I presume, either be plugging into an unused headphone jack that's in the back, or it sounds like you're actually using a splitter where it goes in line with your headset. So your headset plugs into a cable, and then that cable plugs into the normal intercom connection that you'd normally plug into. Is that accurate?
It is, with one exception, and I was trying not to single out my airplane, but we use the LEMO plugs, LEMO, which is a panel-powered Bose. So I'm not using the standard jack that most planes have, especially, well, I don't know how many planes do use LEMO anymore or now use it. The danger in using the LEMO plug through your headset and then saying, oh, I have a couple other jacks, let's say on COM 1 for seat 1 and all of that, is you can't use both of those. So to your point, I plug it into the back passenger jack to separate it from all pilot, co-pilot. Because in some situations, you can't pull from both jacks for a specific seat, the left seat, right seat, or even the passenger. You can only have one of the two in there to get the actual audio out. Does that make sense? I kind of confused myself when I said it.
No, totally. And I just wanted, I've got different kinds of headsets, one with a LEMO plug that I use all the time. I've got others with the standard GA plug, which would be the 1/4-inch plug, and then the 3/8-inch plug for the microphone. And it sounds like you are plugging into the 1/4-inch jack. I'm not aware of any splitter that would allow us to record audio from the LEMO jack. Are you aware of any? Because I'm not.
I'm not aware of that either. Correct. Or I agree.
And I just want to jump in and mention that after I recorded this conversation with Marc, I did a little research, and it turns out that there is a splitter cable available that uses LEMO connectors. So if you're interested in that or any of the other equipment we talk about here, you'll find links for each of those products in the show notes. Yeah, and the LEMO jacks are found in many newer aircraft. For example, Cirrus has been shipping with them for a long time. I was doing some recording in the Vision Jet, a week ago, and I used my LEMO headset for that. And luckily, there is a set of GA jacks for the pilot and co-pilot immediately below the LEMO jack. And so I would just basically plug into that to get the audio. So in that case, I could use my LEMO headset. Sounds like you're doing the same thing. And then you're basically just pulling the audio from a separate 1/4-inch GA jack somewhere in the airplane.
Correct. And I have an older Cirrus G3. So for my seat, left seat, I have a LEMO and then the standard 1/4-inch, as you said. I cannot use both of those at the same time, was my point earlier. So if you can do that in the Vision Jet, if I plug in to my standard jack and my headset's running off the LEMO, I will get nothing out of the standard jack.
Right.
So that's why I go to the back seat behind that center console. Therein lies some other gotchas we'll get into.
Yeah, and I think that raises a key point, which is pilots need to test this stuff ahead of time, because we've just here pointed to an example where it works in the Vision Jet. It doesn't work, at least in the G3 Cirrus. So you got to check these things ahead of time. And there have been times that I've spent an hour in the airplane just experimenting with, well, what if I do it this way? What if I do it that way? And that is time well spent, because if you're trying to do this in flight, it's going to drive you crazy. So it's worth spending the time ahead of time.
Exactly. Yeah. If there's a mistake to be made, I've made it.
Yeah, I'm sure we both have.
Yeah, right.
So there's another source of audio, and I'm just going to reach back here and grab it. So I have been using Lightspeed headsets for quite some time. This is the Zulu 3 that I have, which has a LEMO plug on it, and they have an app that I've used for recording really long time. You get the app on the iPhone, and then basically they include a cable with the headset, and then you just kind of plug that directly into whatever you're using to record with. Now, in this particular case, this is what I use most of the time when I'm doing Facebook live streaming, because what I've done is at the end of the cable, I have added the little lightning adapter for an iPhone. So this is a $7 accessory that you get from Apple. It takes what is the standard 4-pin connector out of the Lightspeed headset, and then it sends it directly to a lightning connector. And I've also done the same thing recording the helicopter. And the helicopter, I'm using the Lightspeed Delta Zulu, which I love because it's got frequency equalization, which helps a little bit with my hearing loss. And it's also got the carbon monoxide monitor.
Huh.
And once again, there's a cable that comes straight off the control box, which you then plug into to anything. Now, you can use Bluetooth from both of these headsets, The factory said to me years ago, we recommend the hardwire connection. And I agree. I have used the Bluetooth a little bit. It's like, it's not as good. So in general, if you're using a headset, I'd recommend a wired connection. And I know that there are other headsets that have jacks on them. So I think people should check their headset and see, is there a way to pull audio off of your headset?
Well, you just brought that up. So I had my Bose next to me, and I know, and I have some Zulus too. On the battery box, there's an audio input or output. I've never used it. So shame on me. That may fix. Let me think about. I have to think about how that may change things. Right? I love this because I've never used it, but there it is. So I'm going to test it out.
All right, very good. Well, all kinds of ideas coming out here. All right, so let's move on and talk a little bit about recording devices. So you mentioned your audio recorder. I've got one as well. I don't know if you've encountered this, but one of the things I found when I got some GoPro cameras a couple of years ago, and I looked at first of all, I tried recording on them, and I had a lot of problem recording good audio onto the GoPro. And I online found many, many people who were also having similar problems. But even if you get perfect audio going into your GoPro, as it jumps from one 4 gigabyte file to the next, there's a little bit of discontinuity with the audio. So the video goes perfectly without losing a frame, but the audio, you lose some fraction of a second, which you can actually see when you look at the file. It's not there. So part of the reason that I use external recording devices is that I get continuous audio. I don't get these gaps in the audio file as the GoPro starts a new segment, because it records in 4 gigabyte file segments. And so as it jumps segments, you lose a little bit of the audio there.
I'll be honest, I've never noticed that on mine because, I watched those segments. And of course, one of the reasons GoPro does that is if you have some corrupt file, it's better to have a segment of it and not lose the rest of the file. And I love that. But I don't know. Maybe you've just gotten into a deeper detail. I've not noticed that I lose any audio there in the transition.
I can see it when I put it in the editing program for video, and you can see the video, and you can actually see where the audio kind of quits at the very end there. So talk a little bit more about your audio recorder and what you like about it and any of the downsides of it, and what model is it?
So I've had this for a few years. It's a Tascam, TASCAM DR-05. And again, it was recommended and from someone I respect, so I didn't do much research. It has stereo mics I'm pointing to at the top, left and right, but of course I don't use that. There's a mic external on the top that I plug into, then the other end goes into the source, which is somehow through the audio panel. And it's not as intuitive for a lot. I mean, I had to spend a lot of time figuring out, and there were some negatives with it. When you use an external that's not hooked up to the video, now you have to sync your videos. Like the old directors, take one. So you have to be able to look at a waveform, which is the lines that represent your audio voice, bunch like this. And I always go clap, clap, clap. And you see 3 spikes, and then I match it up with the 3 spikes through my other sources, and I do it with my hands on it too, so that my lips and what you hear match up. Now, the problem is if you stop a video and don't stop the audio, you're going to have to sync at multiple points. So there's some complexity that you place into the process by using an external recorder, but the quality is great. The control over audio levels is great. The ability to get a continuous stream, no battery issues. Again, just with the AA, they last a lot longer, for instance, than the internal GoPro batteries. So I just found it's my most reliable source of information, but it comes with a bit of complexity, and especially in post-processing to sync it up. What I didn't realize in the beginning, and the old RTFM, read the manual, that if I push the record button, now, and you can see maybe some levels there as I'm talking. Notice the record light is flashing. It's not recording. It's ready to record. You can check your levels and all of that. And I did a whole flight. Nothing came through. You have to push it a second time to get the solid record light. And now it's recording. So that was lesson number 1 on flight number 1. Read the manual. And then to set the levels. With any recording device, you don't want it distorted. You don't want it so quiet. Matter of fact, if you have different sources, and I should mention, Max, I didn't answer the question fully. The other sources, I might do voiceovers at the end, stuff that was recorded in post-processing. I want my levels equal, so it's not like blaring in their ears and distorted in one, and then all of a sudden it drops to nothing. They got to turn up volumes. Oh, you did mono and then you did stereo and only came across in one channel. Now you got a bunch of stuff going on. Therein lies some of the complexity with different sources. And has to be considered. But again, this is foolproof. Once it's recording, I have no questions. Now my only concern is, did I screw up the the video? Because I know this is going to work.
Well, we've all spent hours trying to solve these problems. So hopefully people are learning from this and they'll encounter other problems rather than the ones that we're talking about. So I'm using something that's very similar to the Tascam, and that's the Zoom H4n. And I actually have the original one, and I've also got the newer version, which is the Pro version. And the reason I have this particular one is that this is what I used to use for recording backups for interviews, such as the one that we're doing right now. And for recording podcast, it really helps to have a backup because occasionally the original file is bad. And so the Zoom H4n is what I've been using to record the backup. And there's probably been at least one time where that turned out to be helpful. Now, it's got many of the same features that you're talking about. It's got dual microphones on the top, so you can use it to just record, a meeting, for example, or any audio that you want to record. And it's got 2 different inputs to select from. One would be the microphone set of inputs, and the other would be the line level inputs. And so at the bottom, I'll just go ahead and show the bottom. The bottom has a pair of 1/4-inch foam plug jacks. And so you could plug directly 1/4-inch plugs into the bottom. Those are line level, which are going to be the kind of high level of audio, so stronger signal. And then on the back, it's also got an external microphone input, which would be the low-level output that you would get directly from a microphone. It does have the same issue that you talked about with the record button. If I push it once, then it starts to blink, but it does let me start to adjust the levels on it, which is great. I've got to remember to push it the second time. And yes, there have been flights where I've pushed it once. Hey, I've got the levels set. And then I forget to push it a second time, which kind of goes back to my comment about I need a checklist, I think, in the airplane just for all the audio recording gear. So there are 2 ways that I end up using it. Sometimes I'll use a cable that plugs into the bottom. And so I'll have 1/4-inch plugs going into the bottom. Other times, for example, with the helicopter flight, I've got a separate cable which has essentially a microphone type connector on it, a 3.5 millimeter, and it plugs in for the microphone on the back here. And so the only real downside that I found to this, unlike your recorder, which you say runs for hours on the AA's, mine does not run for hours on the AA's. And so I find that the battery runs down a little quickly. So I've been used to using an external power source for it, which plugs into the bottom. And then I just have a USB input that I put into a battery pack. And the battery packs are handy to have either to charge your phone or various other things, but it keeps my Zoom running forever. So for example, if I'm doing a long day and I wanted to record all 8 hours, hey, I don't have to worry about it. That will keep this thing running throughout it. And then afterwards, it's got an SD card. And so I just basically pop that SD card out, and then I can transfer the audio files over to my computer. Now, how do you transfer the files from your Tascam?
The same way you do it. It has the SD card, a mini, as well as the GoPro does. And then I have my USB hub here, and there's both the mini and the regular size SD card. So I just slide it in. And of course, SD cards themselves, here's the small one that inserts in. So it's going into an adapter. This happens to support either size SD card, so I don't have to use the adapter. And as soon as I plug it in, I have my file folders, which is sorted by date and trip, and just download it in there. I will eventually then get to all of these 4 gig files you talked about. I will label each one and some of the highlights that are in it, and then I can pull it. And of course, it's a WAV file from here, and I use MP4 for my GoPro, and I get organized around that. It's as long as you have a scheme, a plan, it works. You just got to stick to it. I wanted to bring up something else too that you talked about, and maybe the right place. The other, when we talk about sources, we haven't talked maybe about the gotchas of going into the audio panel, but I know a lot of people use like a lavalier mic, and I have one here, and they put this in their ear cup to get ATC. And the side benefit, if you're interested, is you can pick up some of that ambient engine noise. I always try to eliminate that noise, but I've watched other people on YouTube and who have said, no, they like that hum of the engine. And so that's one way to do it. The other way, of course, is just to mix the ambient that comes over the GoPro and this and adjust levels so that you hear the voice more than you hear the engine. But so again, multiple ways to do it with varying levels of complexity. But I have not used the lavalier in the ear cup, which would work. I don't know. I guess it'd have a little ear space where the cable goes, potentially lose a little bit of the noise canceling. Can't be that bad though. So I wanted to bring that up, that I know other people use that as a way to get cockpit audio on their camera.
Well, I'm really happy you brought that up. I meant to mention it, and I realize now I didn't pull my lavalier out of the bag that I've got here. I have used it one time with good success. In my earlier helicopter flights, I was struggling to get the audio correct so that I could record it. And so on one of the early flights, I did that method, and it worked great. Now, in terms of the audio, the noise of the engine, I actually will purposely put some of that in when I'm doing a video, and I'll just pull that from the GoPro camera because it doesn't really pick up anything except engine noise. Right. So I'll just dial that down about 20 dB. And then, yes, you've got that little faint engine noise in the background. But the audio that's recorded on the audio recorder is extremely clean and hardly has any engine noise on it at all. Right. Which is why I end up bringing it in from a different source.
I've never desired it, but hearing you say that and others, I imagine for a lot of listeners that completes the picture, the visual that they get in their head from listening to it, if you will. So that's something I need to consider, because I do want people to feel the energy and get to experience what you and I and so many others get to experience.
Well, let's talk about one other way, a couple other ways that you can record. You and I use audio recorders as our primary way to capture audio. It sounds like in the past you've also used the video camera itself as a way to capture audio. I've at times used my iPhone to capture the audio. Mm-hmm. So for example, with the Lightspeed app, which I think is called Flight Link, I'm able to basically just plug in with the cable that I showed you a moment ago from the headset and record directly onto the iPhone. Now, the one downside of recording to the iPhone is that the file format that Apple uses creates huge files. So you end up with fairly large audio files if you use it. On the other hand, it's incredibly convenient. I've actually used the Flight Link app, not in the airplane, but as kind of a handheld voice recorder. So yes, it's a Lightspeed app. It's designed for use of the headset. It also works standalone. Of course, Apple also has the voice recorder app, or voice memo. I think it's voice memo app, which I was not aware of at the time when I was doing that. But that's another way to go ahead and record the audio. So let's go ahead and talk about setting levels. Certainly that is important. Talk a little bit about why that's important and how you go about doing that.
So I mentioned sometimes I'll do a voiceover after. When I used my video and audio editing app, I didn't realize it was, even though I selected mono and I expected it to be equal on both channels, left and right, it was only sending it over. So people were listening and hearing my voice and everything coming across to both ears equally, and all of a sudden it would just blank out in one ear. So I wasn't testing for that, and I didn't realize that was happening. Similarly, the volume levels from each of the segments and different sources if they're out of whack, they're not the same. It's not as comfortable experience for the listener/viewer. So to me, I always try to take it so that there's no distortion. And if you're looking at the bars, if you will, that are recording that's coming in, we talked about that before. There's a point where if you have a color window, I don't on my task cam, but when I'm looking on some of my computer sources, they turn red, or on a mixer box that I have. Now you're getting into distortion. It's not a comfortable listen for your customer or listener. And so to me, my goal with all is to have consistent volume levels and consistently at a level just below the distortion bar where it crosses over. Again, you see this visually as the editor of the file. And so I play with that in post-production, but just make it easier on myself. I'm always trying to test 1, 2, 3, what level I'm talking at before I hit the record button, and make sure that we set the levels for the voice I plan to speak in, or the voices of the sound sources that are coming over, that they're coming in below that distortion level.
Well, I think that's the key point, is that you've got to check the levels at the time you were recording, because if, for example, the levels are too high, that is, the sound is too loud coming into your recorder, it's going to distort, and you're not going to be able to fix that later. You're just going to have garbage audio that's you can't listen to. So it's really important to check ahead of time and see, hey, is the audio level, not sending the meter into the red on your recorder. So, for example, if we're pulling the audio directly from the 1/4-inch phone plug that we would plug our headset into, then that's going to be what's considered line level audio, which is very strong signal. On the other hand, if you were using the lavalier microphone you mentioned, that's going to be a very low level mic audio, which is a much weaker electrical signal. And your recorder is going to have to be set up very differently for those two different sources, so that if you could even hear the low-level microphone, if you had plugged it into a line-level input, or if you plug the line-level output from the intercom into a microphone input, you're going to vastly overdrive the recorder and distort. So you need to kind of think about what the level is of the audio that you're having, which of the inputs that your recorder might have, plug them into the appropriate one, and then adjust those levels so that, for example, I'm always looking at kind of somewhere around -9 to -12 dB. If in doubt, make the level a little on the low side, because it's pretty easy to boost low-level audio unless it's ridiculously low, but it's impossible to fix audio that's too loud.
Perfect. Yeah, I agree totally. And it's important, that when you mention the line in on the GoPro, and again, I've had issues with this connector, which also I'm looking around. Oh, here's my GoPro. So I have a Hero 7 Black, a little bit old one, but it works perfectly. In the side, I'm showing, I'm not getting, it's hard to see in here, but this USB-C just plugs in like that. And then here I have my external battery, which is another C connector. And to your point, for this, the internal batteries don't last very much time. So I use the, again, recommended a Jackery box, which I have right here, which has 2 USB-Cs coming out, and a way to charge it. It has flashlight too if you need it. So this Jackery allows me to have two outs that I can take, and a long-lasting battery. My flights, I don't generally fly more than 3 hours, but this handles it perfectly. So this will go into the C input here, and then the audio jack goes into the other part. But what's important is when you plug this into the GoPro, there is a menu option that says audio connections. And if you go in, it says input output. First of all, lately it says it doesn't see it, but when it works, you need to make sure you don't select line in, and rather you select standard mic or standard plus or powered mic or powered mic. Those other 4 seem to work fine. Line in you can hardly hear it. It's so quiet. It's not a line in, but it is an external mic. So that's a very important tip to make sure you get the quality of audio that's usable after the fact. And when you talked about the line in, that reminded me of it.
So what do you use to get audio to your Tascam? Some other different kind of cable, I'm guessing?
Yeah, it's a standard audio cable. So I've got it wire tied together. So this merely goes from, into the line in, lights up when I do that. And then the other end will go into for the cockpit, I'll use the standard jack, and then here's the line in. So this goes into the headphone jack, your standard 1/4 inch, and this goes into my Tascam.
Got it. Yep. So you're going from essentially a 1/4 inch phone plug that goes into the intercom to a 3.5 millimeter that plugs into the Tascam. And when I first started recording with my cassette recorder over 20 years ago, I had to make the cable because back in those days, it was pretty difficult to go out and find a cable that was going to exactly do what you needed. And so I learned this trick from an older CFI. We would just go ahead and insert a small resistor between the input to the 1/4 inch phone plug, and that would knock the level down from the high level line output from the intercom. And then it would then go to the 3.5 millimeter, which is pretty close to a 1/8 inch side of the cable. Now in this particular case, this is the 3-pin to the 3-pin. I know this is an area that you and I have run into difficulties in the past, and this is really important to talk about. And that is that some of our plugs and jacks have 4 connectors and some have 3. And this will definitely mess up your audio. And I know that this was the problem that I was dealing with when I first started doing audio in the helicopter. So for example, the wire that comes off of my headset for the Zulu, the Lightspeed Zulu, is 4 conductor. And so that's known as TRRS. Stands for tip, which is the end, RR, the 2 rings, and then sleeve, which is the last one. And this is very common on iPhones, for example. It includes both the headphone connection and the microphone connection. But many devices, such as audio recorders, have only 3 inputs, so-called TRS. So that's tip, ring, sleeve. And yes, when you connect them, it might work. Or if it's stereo, you only get one side of it. Most likely it's not going to work unless you wiggle it and then hold it in that exact position. And so the solution, and I've never had one of these before, I just went out and ordered it so that hopefully this will solve problems like that in the future. But I got an adapter cable, and I've looked for these in the past and had a really hard time finding something that goes from 4-pin to 3-pin. And this is, I'll put a link to this in the show notes, but this was about $6 off of Amazon. And essentially, if you plug your 4-pin plug into one side, it comes out to 3 on the other. And what they've done is they've stripped out the microphone. So essentially now you're just getting the stereo audio. And that's what you need when you're recording.
Yeah. And then the way, if it isn't clear, I'm going to hold them up. You're exactly right. And I got to see if you can see. Yeah. So notice this one has 3 rings on it, little black stripes, and this one has 2. So that's what Max is talking about. That this, for instance, with GoPros, you can't use the one with the 3 rings. You have to use the 1, 2 rings as the source that will work, or the plug that'll work to get to your camera. So that is the one problem I found on the internet, is a lot of people say it doesn't work and they're using this one when they need to use this one.
Actually, that could be the one lifesaver of everything we've talked about that will solve people's problems, is figuring out, how do I get from the 4 conductor to the 3 conductor? And is that important? And the answer is,
and then how do I know?
Yeah. And the answer is, that's the whole ball game. You gotta solve that particular problem. So one other cable that I use, and this works for the line inputs in the bottom of my Zoom H4n, It goes from a 3-conductor quarter-inch foam plug that plugs into the intercom. It splits out to a pair of 2-conductor, so just a tip and sleeve quarter-inch phone plugs. So this also goes from 3 to 2, if you will. Basically, I end up with both channels on my Zoom recorder having recorded. Often when I'm recording, I only get one channel, and it doesn't matter because I can solve that in the editing so that people hear it out of both ears, even if I'm only got the audio on one channel initially.
I need to switch my editing software. Mine, I've had trouble doing that, but it's probably user error like so many things. It probably has the capabilities.
Oh, that's great. Well, I think we've covered a whole lot of ground here. Let me ask you this. When you're in the airplane recording, do you ever find yourself being just a little bit careful about what you say so that you don't end up posting something on the internet that you wouldn't be proud of?
I think about that. And if I have passengers, I remind them of that. But one of the things, I'm a very detail-oriented person, and I listen to every second of whatever recording before I publish anything. And I listen not casually. I'm intently listening. And I think you alluded to it. If you didn't, I'll say it now. I want this to be so good. If I have an extra second gap where there's more silence than I want, I edit it out. Right? So it's comfortable to listen to. I'm not perfect on that, but it adds hours to my editing time. So if I hear something that is inappropriate, another person's name is mentioned, or a personal anecdote that just has no place being there, I just edit it out. And I will never say, oh, wow, that felt really good. Publish it and whatever happens. Because of exactly that. There's bound to be something said, even a word you don't want to use. It's, a 4-letter word, let's say. It has no place out there, and I feel accountable to make sure it's right. And certainly I'm sure I'll make mistakes, but that's very high on my list of things to check before I publish. Is there anything that is just not appropriate? But again, I will also remind people and get their permission if they're in a passenger. Hey, I'm recording this. I'll edit anything out, any problem. Just common courtesy.
Yeah, and 2 things on that. In addition to editing out something that might sound offensive to somebody, you also want to make sure that you're not posting something that might incriminate you. And I'm thinking, for example, of a gentleman who posts a lot of YouTube videos, and he had one in which he was clearing the runway at a non-towered airport. And he basically said, clearing the active or clearing runway 22. And he had not yet crossed the hold line.
Right.
And apparently the FAA came after him for that. I was kind of surprised because to me, clearing kind of says, hey, we're in the process of doing it. But I guess a very strict interpretation was, hey, you were not clear at the point you said that. So I've been a little bit more careful about actually making sure that I'm fully across the hold line and just say that I'm clear the active as opposed to say that I'm clearing before I even reach the line.
Mac, I'm aware of that one. Matter of fact, it was turned in by a CFI, and I saw the response from the producer of the video. Was very upset, as I would have been. We all have taken that. You're at a non-towered field. There's a lot of people. You're clear of it, but you're not technically clear. But every flight I go on now, when I'm with a pilot that does that, I tell them that story. You got to be careful in today's world for all the right reasons.
Well, and speaking of being careful, if you're recording and you've got somebody else in the airplane, it really makes sense to say, hey, do you mind if I record this today? And most people are going to say, no, that's no problem.
Right.
But you don't want to find out after the fact that they were not happy with you recording. Talk about some gotchas.
Some gotchas. And these are usually connection gotchas and things. So let's say I'm pulling just cockpit audio and ATC audio, and I'm running it through the audio panel. Well, I've gotten to the end of the flight and all of a sudden nothing's there. Remember I said that I use the back seat plug? Well, on my audio panel, I have a Garmin GMA 350C, which is the 3D and all of that. But just like the 347s and the 340 Garmins, and I'm sure the PS engineering, you have to select the sources: pilot, co-pilot, passenger. the passenger, my previous pilot, had turned them off. So nothing was coming across. So I was plugged in appropriately, but the audio panel was silenced by a button push, a configurable button push. So you want to make sure the light is on. And on a lot of them, you set the volume for either front seat, back seat, or by position, depending on your audio panel. Make sure you've got some level of volume there and it's not silenced with the volume. And then the other piece that I have had so many issues with, we talked about, I'm going to hold this up again and put in my jack. So this is the part that goes into the GoPro. This is N-Flight Cam, N-F-L-I-G-H-T or T-E, I don't know, cam. And when you plug this in, it's actually relatively loose. With gravity, it pulls out a little and you'll lose the connection. Now, this device comes with a little rubber grommet or something that wraps around and kind of holds these together. It didn't do a very good job, and then I lost it. So I've used everything from a rubber band to a Live Strong type rubber wristband and cut holes in it so it fits over, because you want constant pressure up between this jack or this plug and this jack, because this is very easy, just with a little bit of gravity that pulls out and you lose the audio. And I've lost so many until I fashioned the connector that I wanted to highlight that. So yeah, it's very rewarding. I actually enjoy the post-processing. I thought it would be a hassle, but I've learned a lot, and I care about what goes out there, and mistakes are something I don't want to go out if it's authored by me, even though we all make mistakes. But with proper planning, I love your idea of the checklist and all. There's some real enjoyment and value that you'll get through the process, you as someone that's making, when I say you, to your audience and to my audience, but also to us in terms of knowledge learned, new skills, and fun things to do in aviation.
Yeah, it's definitely totally awesome, and I think incredibly valuable to record. So, Marc, looking forward to recording with you soon to talk about video. Thanks so much for joining us today and talking about audio.
Always a pleasure. I really appreciate it, and safe travels and blue skies.
And my thanks to Marc for joining us today. You can hear his Simple Flight radio podcast at simpleflight.net, and I've included a link to that and his YouTube channel in our show notes. But of course, you can find links to all of the gear we talked about in our show notes and at aviationnewstalk.com/276. And if you feel like you've learned something from this episode or any of our many other episodes, I'd like to invite you to sign up and become a member to join the club. Just head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, or you can make a one-time donation by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up, and remember that you can always go around.